Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Marco Ferrari, a designer and researcher based in Milan. I'm incredibly honored to be here with all of you today to moderate this conversation between artists whose work I've been following and admiring for a very long time. I believe the themes we'll touch upon today will be many and multi-layered, given the depth of the individual practices of Suzanne, Ayoung, and Evan, and the plenty of crossovers between them. I would say, though, that we likely pivot around issues of authority representation, especially in the context of what is usually presented as objective or scientific image making. The blurred boundaries between truth, conspiracy, and imagination, and the role of technical literacy and critique in the understanding of contemporary power structures. I'll say a few words about the structure of this panel. We'll start with a short introduction about a few more words from the curators about the theme of today, and short bios about the participants. Then we'll have a round of presentations. We'll have Suzanne connecting online, and then Ivan and Ayoung from here. And these presentations will be the base and the platform for a conversation that will help us to go deeper into the questions raised by the works and the researches presented. We'll then have time hopefully for questions, both from the audience here and the one following us from online. So, diving in. In the words of transmedial curators, maps are not notoriously biased and sometimes imprecise. Dependent on a fixed set of coordinates and proportions, they unfold as narratives about landscapes. But each is scaled in directions skewed in perspectives, limiting what is known and can be navigated. Unsatisfied with the biases of mapping projections, Ayoung Kim, Ivan Roth, and Suzanne Treister have turned to fiction, speculation, mathematics, and visions to revise orientations, moving us in new directions. Through the constructions of new imaginaries, they reveal alternative words and relations, destabilizing centralized and exclusionary representations of terrains and our navigations through them. I'll give you a short introduction to each of them. Suzanne Treister, connecting from London, I think, is a contemporary artist. Working in the 80s as a painter, she became a pioneer in the digital and new media field in the 90s, making work about emerging technologies, developing fictional worlds and international collaborative organizations. Utilizing different media, such as video, the internet, photography, drawing, and watercolor, Suzanne has evolved a large body of work which engages with eccentric narratives and unconventional bodies of research to reveal structures that bind power, identity, and knowledge. For more than 3 decades, often spanning several years, her project comprised fantastic reinterpretations of given taxonomies and histories that examine the existence of covert and unseen forces at work in the world, whether corporate, military, or paranormal. Ayoung Kim, joining us from South Korea, is a visual artist and filmmaker. She synthesizes geopolitics, mythology, technology, and futuristic iconography, and retroactively collects the speculative time to infiltrate the present. She reconstructs reality through a hybrid narrative that reflects the improbabilities of the world, with her interest in agents and events that cross boundaries and worlds, as well as ambiguous or intermediate states. Her work takes the form of video, audio, sonic fiction, VR, images, diagrams, text, and game simulations, and has been presented in exhibitions, performances, live shows, and publications. Ivan Roth is an artist based in Berlin, whose practice visualizes, archives, and challenges our perceptions of typically unseen aspects of rapidly changing communication technology. Creating prints, sculptures, videos, and websites, his work explored the relationship between misuse, empowerment, technology, and infrastructure. One of his most recent works, Skyscapes Berlin Mitte, an exploration of the sky and historical cartographic projection standards, is premiered last night at Panke Gallery here in Berlin, and you can also see it here at Transmediale on the way to the Blue Room. I give now the stage to our participants, and we'll start with Suzanne.
Hello? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, okay. So All right, I was going to start today by talking about my most recent project, which is called Scientific Dreaming. Uh, it's a project which I carried out in the summer while I was doing a residency at Quebec on Lake Geneva, which was very near to CERN, where I'd already done several projects since 2018. I'd had the idea for scientific dreaming before COVID, but it involved doing some workshops with scientists. I wasn't able to do it until, fortunately, I had this residency last year. And the idea was, I'd had this idea which really excited me, which was to try and get scientists to write science fiction stories in order to solve the climate crisis. So in order to get them to kind of delve into their subconscious, to delve into their subconscious minds, to try and come up with some kind of new ideas, new scientific breakthroughs that might actually work. And so the way it worked, if you look on this is the main menu webpage, you can see. If you go to this, the first icon, the dark green one, you can see the plot diagrams that I carried out with the scientists. So how I did it is I saw them each individually. We had like a quite intensive hour-long session, during which time they had an A3 sheet of paper and I had an A3 sheet of paper. And I started off trying to get them into quite a hypnotic state, speaking very slowly. And I first of all asked them, I didn't tell them what this was about. I asked them to write down 4 dates, one on each corner of the paper. Then I asked them to draw 4 circles in the center and in each circle to write a name. And at this point, they were a little bit hesitant. They didn't know what kind of name. They didn't really know what was happening. Eventually, they got in the swing. And then I asked them to draw 4 circles on either side of the names and to write the occupation of the person that they'd named, and maybe think a bit about who that person was. And then I asked them to draw a big semicircle at the top. And in that, I wanted them to think very carefully about, based on their own research and what they knew scientifically, I wanted them to imagine a really extreme radical breakthrough that could have implications for the planet. As we talked, they'd think of something, and then I'd try and push them a bit further to stretch them as much as possible to think through to something which may not be possible now, but which could maybe be possible in the future, which could have some radical impact. Then I asked them to come down and below the characters and below their occupations to do 4 more circles, and I asked them to write down a dream that they imagine each of those characters may have had. So during this process, they're going into a more and more kind of subconscious level. I said the dreams could be based on dreams they themselves had had. And then, so if we maybe go to one of the diagrams, in particular, Francesco's, perhaps the 3rd row down, the second one along. 3rd row down, or her? 3rd row down, second one along. If you click on it, that's it, you're there, that's it, yep. And then you can enlarge it by clicking again. And so then, yes, so if you scroll around there, you can see where I'm talking about. If you scroll down, so we come to those are the 4 characters, the occupations, and you can see the dreams. And if you scroll up to the big oval, you can see their scientific development they'd imagined. And then I asked them, after writing the dreams, I asked them to go back to the scientific development and in some circles above to write what could be the outcomes, what could be the actual outcomes of that development in the world, thinking of positive ones and obviously also negative ones. And after that, I asked them to come down to the characters and draw 4 more circles at the bottom and write down what would be the outcomes of that scientific breakthrough for their 4 imaginary characters on their lives. And then I asked them to write 4 locations and 4 events. And when we'd finished, I asked them what did they imagine this was about, and they weren't sure. And they thought it might be something for what I was going to use for a project. And then I said no. I said look down at your diagram, what you're looking at is a plot diagram for a science fiction short story that you're going to write. At which point they kind of hesitated and they got really excited and said, wow, what a great project for the summer. And they were all very, very positive about it. And a lot of them had found they'd had ideas which they were not, which they hadn't previously thought of. So I don't know how long I've got, but I did want to, 12 of them have now done these short stories. And so some of them came up with some amazing ideas about if we could actually identify dark matter and dark energy, it could possibly produce a limitless clean energy source. That was one of the most positive outcomes. For example, Michael Doser, he took us through the end of the climate crisis of the 21st century, through the anti-technological 22nd century, to the 23rd century when science returned, but there was a perfect balance of new technology and Paleolithic models of resource allocation. I can read you a quote here. Dealing with the hydro wars and the polydemics revitalized science, but accompanied by a deeper understanding than that which led to the stop and go, even if increasingly concerted tackling of the causes of climate change in the mid-21st century, or the wholesale rejection of technology in the 22nd. This new scientific renaissance led, in fact, to a renewed awareness and understanding of the Paleolithic balance of innovation with societal needs and the availability of scarce resources, and thus a system of resource allocation and reuse rules that were technologically implemented in a simple, transparent, and to a large extent egalitarian manner, and consequently perceived as just. Some art historians even trace a direct line from the current highly popular paleotech Simverses fad, so characteristic of the new Dark Age, to the visions Takeshi wove into the last third of her novel. Art not only predicting, but actually shaping the future. One of the other scientists took us through several phases of the evolution of machine intelligences into the deep future, where there are new ideas of consciousness and where the machine intelligences are perpetually seeking enlightenment. So this is a quote from halfway through. This has led to a proliferation of hyperconscious machines of an enormously rich variety. Each one carried its own universe within itself, an evolving world of its own. Clearly a spiritual one, since almost nothing resembled the physical world anymore. And then he finishes, in his final paragraph, he says, on the other hand, as humans had already suspected, there was an intrinsic relation between quantum information and the physical geometry of space-time, the latter being, in a sense, emergent from the former. Now that computational processes had intensified so much, the density of quantum bits foreseeably hitting fundamental boundaries, a controlled influence of cognitive processes on physical space-time started to appear on the horizon. Macroscopic entanglements realizing wormholes just generated by conscious decisions appeared possible in the distant future. Very distant indeed, but there were many more billions of years of evolution up ahead. Entity 1 was aware of that, but there was no way to get anywhere near it with its electronic hardware. It was time to stop and merge with something better. So, if you go back to the website, we'll just finish off with this. If you go back to the menu and go to the previous page, I'll just, before you click, those 9 diagrams are diagrams where I've extrapolated myself from each of the scientists' plot diagrams, so that you can see for example, one whole page with the scientific outcomes, one whole page with the effects of those outcomes, and etc. And if you go back to the menu, Olha, the far right, where there's some text, if you click on there, on that page, if you want to look later, you can see excerpts and quotes from each short story. And the stories are going to be all published in a volume by CERN in the summer, in a book celebrating 10 years of arts at CERN. They'll be like an insert. And we're looking for a more like a literature publisher to publish them so they can be available in bookshops. Yeah, okay, thanks.
Thanks everybody for joining. Thank you. Happy to be here today. My name's Evan. I thought I'd give a really quick overview of some of my past work. I'm going to focus on two projects that I thought might be apt to the conversation we're having today. For those of you that were with me in my session last night, if you'll permit me to repeat myself a little bit, I'll be very grateful. Thank you. I'm going to keep it short. But a lot of my work has to do with looking at sort of unseen aspects of communication technologies. This is from a series of installations called Since You Were Born. Earlier work of mine was looking more at public space and thinking about where we have agency within the media landscape. Net art has always been a big influence of mine. I love making net art. I continue to make net art. One of the series that I'm going to mention today specifically, which is net art, is this Red Line series, or landscapes, which has to do with the physicality of the internet and linking that to ideas about landscape and history and ideology. That series looks like this. The imagery is shot with an infrared camera, and I'm sort of using the color red in two ways in this project, one of which is that infrared is the way that data travels through fiber optic cables. This is the frequency range that laser light travels through fiber optics, and so the camera I'm filming with in this series is modified to shoot within this near infrared region. And then the second reference for that color is to the all red line, which I talked about yesterday also, which is this sort of predecessor to our current network. Many of you are probably already familiar with it, but it's the first telegraph cable to circumnavigate the globe. This was a project by the British military where it would only land in like imperialist territories controlled by the British. And so the reason it's called the all red line is that the maps were commonly colored with the British territories in red. So this early network, the all red line, is sort of this historic predecessor to our modern network. And so this project was trying to tie that together and thinking about how networks is something that is composed in the landscape today. A contemporary landscape includes all these things that we can't see, and it's connected to these history and landing at a lot of these same beaches. And so in this project, I was going out and filming at a lot of these fiber optic cable landing locations. I can show, let's see how the internet does. I'll show one piece. This is from Hong Kong. They're very slow pieces. This one, very slow. Like you have to sit with it for a moment to even see the clouds against the cables. If you look very closely, you can see it moving. So I'm interested in kind of slow practices, especially sort of in reference to the accelerationist tendencies a lot of are subject to these days. And so this work it involves the internet. It's moving very quickly through fiber optic cables, obviously, but it's experimenting with slowness as sort of a practice. Another part of the work is if you take the URL here and copy it, and let's see if I can do this with one hand. Take that to a map and paste it in. The URL kind of functions as a dual address for the piece, and so it's one address within the network, obviously, and then a second address as a GPS coordinate, so an address within the globe. And so the media you're linked to is from these locations. So that I would shoot that video in that infrared camera. That video would then sit on a server in Hong Kong. And the idea is that when you would access that URL, your computer, your phone, you'd be physically connected to that machine. There'd be some server with a green LED blinking somewhere in Hong Kong because you've connected that fiber optic path. And as NetArt, like another way to explore it is to sort of go through the process, and you can find these little clues. So this is the Hong Kong beaches. The fiber optic cable came right up through this sort of valley. I think I was filming underneath this radio tower here, which is what those cables were. And so this is some of how that process works for that project. And let's see where I left off. And that process was one that I built over the course of several years and started to develop this network. And so it sort of resulted in this kind of networked performance peer-to-peer network that existed for 2 years, where all of these nodes and servers that I was setting up at these landscapes that I was filming in all became connected, and then users who were viewing the work would also become peers in that network, so that the sort of medium of this work was shared as a peer-to-peer network, so that when you were viewing these videos, you were also then starting to upload, and you were becoming a node within the network. And this was kind of one of the handoffs to maps for me. towards the end of this project, and this is part of what I talked about yesterday, I started getting interested more in thinking about maps and thinking about cartography. And part of what I was trying to do in that Red Lines project was connect networks to histories, to things like bias and things like ideology that sometimes we don't associate with those systems. And maps became to me a kind of a place where that conversation had already been happening within cartography. People already have been talking about how bias is affecting who is centered within this system, which I think is a good question that we can be asking about technology and about networks. And so I got into thinking about mapping projections. I hadn't been sort of introduced to this world prior to this project, so it was maybe a big step towards going down that rabbit hole for me, but I got into understanding more about the history of these mapping projections being just how do you take the spherical globe and flatten it to a plane. And there's all these different ideas about how to do that. It's kind of an impossible problem. There's no perfect way to flatten the globe into these flat representations of it, and so something's always flawed within them. And so that's kind of where it became an interesting place for me to be thinking about bias, like what kinds of biases appear within this system of translating between a sphere and between a flat plane. So the software looks like this. I have it running locally here. It's at worldsandfigures.com. It's free software. It runs in a browser. I won't go over it too much now, but it's the main point of it is that you have this drop-down menu with all these different mapping projections, and you can manipulate the geographic data that's included within the software, but you can also bring in your own imagery to start warping any imagery with these historic mapping projections. What I used it for initially was to do an exhibition that just closed in December at the Berlin State Library. I found in this library the maps reading room through the research I was doing, which is this incredible space. So if there's anybody who loves maps, I highly recommend going to the maps reading room at the Berlin State Library on Unter den Linden. It's an incredible place. And so I ended up doing this painting exhibition that was using the software. So the software was kind of designed for me over the course of 3 years to make this painting exhibition. And so I then sort of premiered the paintings at this exhibition, which were sort of nestled in with the books and the maps and the artifacts, and trying to create a sort of a dialogue with the history and the research that was a part of that work. There's also a mural that's still there that's kind of semi-permanent, so it's closed on the weekend for those that are out of town. But for those that are here, if you're interested in seeing this location, the reading room or the Berlin State Library, the mural is still there. And then what I talked about, or what I premiered last night, if anybody's at the Rosa show last night, thanks so much for coming, by the way, was a new series that's also based on this software, but it's using the animation aspects of kind of warping through these different mapping projections and rotating around in different ways that we're creating these animated systems. I sort of started getting into the circle and square relationship, the historical ways that circles and squares have shown up in different places kind of throughout history, which I think I won't go into too much, but just to say that the squaring the circle was this, if you've heard the phrase, it's kind of used to mean trying to solve this impossible problem. And so squaring the circle was this mathematical conundrum that mathematicians were sort of racing to solve that was later proved to be impossible. And so somewhere in this project, I like this idea of thinking about that relationship between circles and squares, thinking about how that translation process that happens from a sphere to a plane, the sort of impossibility of doing that perfectly, and sort of the impossibility of making systems that are totally free of biases. And so there's somewhere in there, I released this series of skyscape-based animations. You might have seen one that's in the monitor out front that's running here. There's more running at the Rosa Gallery. There are also websites, which I'm happy to share with anybody. They're kind of public now. The websites are being served out of my basement in my apartment. So the idea is this is like where the Landscapes project was very kind of globally expansive. The Skyscapes project is meant to be very localized. So it's just these animated web pieces you can view in a browser. When you view them, you sort of come into my apartment, you go to this server, I mean through the cables, of course, and then you're viewing these skies that I've been taking photographs of here in Berlin throughout the winter. So if there's any kind of like vitamin D deprived, seasonally depressed people in the audience, that this is me trying to survive through these gray Berlin winters, of which the last few days have actually been beautiful. So this winter, whenever the sky would break, I would run outside, I would try to find high ground, and I would take photos of the sky kind of above where I live and try to find these views of the sky beyond the clouds. And then those were what I was using to then bring into the system. So part of the way the software works is you can just drag and drop an imagery in. It will update the base layer. We can turn off all of the other geographic data just for a moment, which is how these animations are sort of produced. And then I would spend time, the same way with the paintings, where I would spend time sort of looking through different projections that I found interesting, manipulating different rotation points, and then deciding on compositions I thought were interesting. So this was sort of the process. And then when I would find something I thought looked good, I don't know if I can find something quickly that looks nice here. Maybe this one looks nice. Then you can send this out, render it out, and these were sort of becoming the works that I premiered last night at this exhibition. You can see them in the lobby if you don't want to go onto the internet. But yeah, sort of like blending the skies with historical algorithms designed to flatten the earth. You can bring them, live with these in your home. If you're living under gray skies, you can run them on old phones you might have, old laptops, or run them on your phone while it's charging. And this is what I do at home. I run it next to where I wash dishes, and it becomes this like colorful window when there's no color sort of coming from above. So I'll leave it there. Thank you, and I will hand it over to Ayoung.
Thank you, Evan.
Thanks, Ivan, for great project. Hi, everyone. My name is Ayoung Kim. I'm a visual artist and a filmmaker working on videos, moving images, sonic fictions, performances, VR chat performances, and most recently, a game simulation. For many years, I have deployed speculative fiction as an aesthetic and political tool to navigate our contemporary circumstances. I would like to share one of my recent projects called Delivery Dancer Sphere and some of my research behind the project. This is quite slow, just one moment. Okay. So this is the door of my hotel room that I'm currently staying in Berlin. 2 days ago, I placed a food delivery order through an app. I was a bit lazy to go out to grab some food. After taking the photo, I realized that I left my key in the room, and the room was locked. And I was wearing my pajamas, so I had to call the staff members to open the door. I was quite humiliated by them. So this was the first experience using Lieferando or something. It's a local app, right? Delivery app. And all the apps in the world for delivering food are almost the same, using the same navigation system followed by GPS and the fastest delivery algorithm. So I guess every one of us has an experience of using food delivery services, especially during the pandemic. It became highly popular during the pandemic in South Korea, where I currently live. And almost every day I ordered food through various delivery apps. And in Korea, we normally don't see the rider's face. They just run away after putting the bag in front of the door to avoid possible infections and to get more delivery calls. It was a time when the individual mobility was prohibited, and those delivery riders were the most mobile entities, while everything else was quite immobile in the road, in the city. And the project Delivery Dancer Sphere started with my curiosity that where those delivery riders go after the delivery and how they navigate, move around in the city. This is a 25-minute video, and in this cyberpunk speculative fiction, there's a protagonist called N-Storm, which is an anagram of monster, a female delivery rider working for a platform called Delivery Dancer in the fictitious Seoul. In the story, Seoul becomes a labyrinth of endlessly regenerating routes, delivery routes, and the delivery dancers pursue never-ending deliveries under the control of a master algorithm called Dance Master. The project is not only about the gig economy and platform labor, which have become immensely popular in South Korea during the pandemic, but also about the topological labyrinth, the possible words, and the hyper-alertness. Well, those days the delivery riders have this huge urge to be faster and faster for their deliveries. And the acceleration is urged for optimization of body, time, and space.
댄스 마스터는 항상 액션이 최소화되는 걸 좋아해. 그게 가장 우아한 방식이라고 생각하거든. 나는 A에서 B로 가기 위해 무한한 과제를 수행해야 돼. 그런데 나한테 주어진 시간은 무한하죠. 에르스트는 영원히 계속 갈 수 없어.
So, to develop the project, I found an experienced female delivery rider for interview. Well, female riders are quite rare in South Korea, but they exist. I interviewed her several times, and we went out for deliveries for several days. So I sat on her backseat on her motorbike and enjoyed the streets of Seoul. And this image is the first delivery that I went out with her. It was a delivery for delivering a set of croissant to Riverside in the middle of nowhere, so it took a while to find where the destination is. And I realized that those riders really hate this kind of remote calls, and they have this right to cancel the call. But once you cancel the call several times, then you have penalty, and sometimes it comes out to be blockage of your app. So yeah, it's a highly kind of classified system of delivery. With this experience, for me, the most impressive and interesting feature was that the rider's attention is completely absorbed to the app while riding the road. They don't watch the real road, but watch the mobile phone screens. They normally use two mobile phones, one for the receiving calls through the app, and the other one is actual navigation. This is because the delivery apps doesn't provide the actual navigation through the roads. They only provide the straight lines from the pickup point to the destination. And it creates a lot of problems for delaying calls and things. Okay. This is the image of the actual distance through the road, and the left one is showing the app's calculation, the master algorithm calculation of delivery route. So yeah, the left one shows only 3.6 kilometers, whereas the next one shows 6.3, almost the double distance. And this caused almost all the problems through the delivery services, especially in Asian countries, megacities. The riders working under heavy pressure not to be late. And there have been many tragic accidents, competitions, and when accidents happen, the riders are not protected by the employment law because they are not employers, but the freelancers, the platform laborers. This video is showing the apps, actually how it functions with the app. This one shows the price ranges and distances at various spots. Okay. And this is, okay, to the next, move to the next. Yeah, this is a tracked record showing how they travel through the day. It's a Google record, actually. The app doesn't provide any record like this. I heard that riders tend to record this travel and feel proud of their daily labor, so they kind of upload those screenshots on some community. When the riders become late for their delivery, they tend to say, "Oh, I just did what the AI guided me to do." So the AI is responsible for their delay. So this is how it goes, and it somehow reminds me of this 18th century, 19th century Luddite movement that at the time those textile workers protested against the machine, the jacquard machine, when the machine replaced their labor. And those labor union for riders, they protest against the platforms for revealing the algorithm, how they calculate those routes. And the riders are not the only entities who cannot rate any of the agencies, whereas there are several entities like the restaurants, the ordered person, the customer, and the riders and the master algorithm, the platform. So every one of these can rate the rider, but the rider cannot rate the other selves. So in this cyberpunk fiction, the female delivery rider is trapped in an endlessly regenerating labyrinth of delivery calls and routes. The technology behind the delivery systems and the navigation is rooted in the GPS, obviously, Global Positioning System, which was firstly developed for military purpose in the US. And then it became public in 1983 due to a tragic flight attack. Probably you might have heard of it. In 1983, there was a flight from Alaska to Seoul carrying 269 passengers. It's a Korean Air 007, stayed off its intended course and entered into Soviet airspace. It was at the height of the Cold War era. The airplane used INS navigation system. It's one of the still existing navigation method. But somehow it is later revealed that INS didn't work so well, so they really deviated the route to the Soviet Union sky. And it was attacked by an aircraft, Soviet aircraft. And then this was the event that US president then authorized the use of then GPS by civil commercial airplanes for the first time. And since then, as we all know, the world became like this. We all depend on, relying on the GPS. GPS requires minimum 28 satellites around the globe. Each satellite sends the signal to each devices, including our mobile phone, and then it coordinates the position. These images show how nowadays the GPS satellite signals are purposely jammed or spoofed. This is a website called GPS Jam, developed by John Wiseman. Thanks, Marco, for letting us know the website. And we can see where in our globe the GPS jamming is happening at the moment on a certain date. The red area shows the highly jammed area, and the yellow follows, and the green. So here, it's not only the land, but also the oceans. The airplanes, ships, vehicles, drones, missiles, all kinds of mobile things can be jammed or spoofed quite easily, as those machines are all relying on the dominant GPS technology. When the important political figures move, then the GPS jamming vehicle just follows, I heard. And every military barrack have this GPS jamming machine. And we see in this picture, near the Moscow, we always see the red signs actually, and Syrian area. So we see that how fragile the GPS-driven military machines and missiles could be. They can function easily once the GPS is jammed. And what happens these days, under this threat, the US Navy starts to teach the celestial navigation again, which has been regarded as a bygone technology since the GPS dominance. Before the dominance of GPS in the ancient times, the only absolute navigation method was the celestial navigation, reading the star chart and looking at the North Star in the northern hemisphere, and in the southern hemisphere, they saw the Southern Cross. So looking up and reading the stars and constellations were the only way of navigate in the right way and to coordinate themselves. And US Navy started to teach it again in a few decades' time. Because they said, we went away from celestial navigation because computers are great. The problem is there's no backup in the rise of threats in cyberspace. So old-fashioned techniques are coming again. And you know that the celestial navigation is still the only one and only absolute uninterrupted way of navigation technology, still. Even the GPS satellites have to rely on the celestial navigation for their primary coordination, because the stars and constellations are the only unchangeable beings in navigation. So it still remains as an absolute thing. Then, apart from the celestial navigation, what kind of indigenous navigations used to exist in history? There were actually a lot. Each ethnographic local culture used to have their cosmotechnics, so-called, which combines their philosophy of living, way of understanding the universe and cosmology. And it comes out to their unique technologies. This is called stick chart. Probably some of you might know it. Used in Polynesian and Micronesian sailors. They used to be the best sailors in the world in the ancient times. They crossed more than 1,000 islands in between, all the way through the North Pacific Ocean without any compass, actually, magnetic compass. And these were the stick chart. This shows not only the distance between the islands or some landmarks, but also shows these ocean swell patterns. I don't know how to read it. And this open framework depicts major ocean swell patterns and the ways the island are disrupted. Those islands disrupted those patterns. Reading and interpreting the chart was a crucial skill handed down through generations. And they used canoes and stick chart for navigation until the mid-20th century, when they gradually switched it to electronic navigation system. This is another technology called star compass, also used by those people. These technologies were proved as highly accurate in contemporary era. It was proved in the 1980s, I think, 90s. Those traditional sailors only relied on this star compass and the stick chart and traveled across the Pacific Ocean. So it proved to be very accurate. This is another way of navigating system. This is Asian traditional GPS called Yundo in Korean. It includes so many different things. It includes constellation reading technique and compass and calendar mechanics, and also fortune telling. Fortune telling is really an important part of Asian tradition, as you know. So there is some special people who is familiar with this technique. They brought this to everywhere, every landmark, to decide where is a lucky place to build a house, and also to find some possible tombs for important figures and politicians back in the era. So all those technologies, I only named only two, Polynesian and Micronesian thing and Asian technology. Those two could be a representation of kind of bygone and disappeared cosmotechnics, which could be very interesting to look back and how it shaped our understanding of the cosmos as you all might know, here is what 3 words. This is another way of navigation, right? And kind of game-changing thing, I think. But it's still relying on the GPS thing. But I heard it's really helpful to rescue those people in the middle of the bushfire and some emergency circumstances. So this is the end of the presentation. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much to all the 3 of you for these incredible presentations. And so diverse, of course, in the different use of media and technologies and tools to investigate these narratives and technologies. What is striking for me is, besides the present, literal presence of maps in all of your work, is somehow the underlying fascinations or obsession with the cartographic form of visualization. And I think in the work of Eva, maybe this is more directly connected to the exploration of projection standards and the codes of geographical representation, but also the central role that cartography played in the depiction and portrayal of global infrastructure. No, specifically thinking about your work, Red Lines. In the work of Suzanne, there's this kind of decade-long exploration of diagrams and almost like the whole history of information design, from references to medieval manuscripts to contemporary corporate graphics in its kind of the power of transmitting information and conveying information. And then I think in the work of Ayoung, there is this the central role of interfaces and the way in which they convey, they kind of connect the body to the planet and the kind of overarching navigation infrastructure. And also I think really interesting the relationship between algorithms and route optimization techniques and labor and time. So maybe I have a first round of questions to each one of you, which is there a moment in your practice in which there was a conscious realization that this understanding and attention to the cartographic became somehow central to your work? Yeah. Feel free to jump in. Yeah, Suzanne, please. Yeah.
I think I may be wrong, and there may be something from my childhood history, but the first thing that I can remember is when I first started working on my first website, 1995, and I'd invented this fictional time-traveling alter ego called Rosalind Brodsky, and I was started to build up the project as a website and also as a series of time-traveling costumes simultaneously. And part of the website was her time-traveling diary. So I had about 92 different pages from her diary, which had video and text on them. And at the bottom of the page, you could click to go to the next page or the previous page, or you could click a button which said time travel. And if you time traveled, you traveled to a different time and place in the diary. The diary was not just a one-year diary, it was like a kind of perpetual diary. And so it got very, very confusing. So I had a huge big drawing on my wall of all the 92 pages and which page and which time and place connected to which other one. So I had to draw lines between them all. So I ended up with this giant big map diagram thing of my alter ego in time and space and locations and events. And I never did it as an artwork. I did it as just a way of visualizing what I was doing, so I didn't get completely lost in the rhizomatic nature of the web, which was my first experience of working with it. And so, I guess that was it. And I think when I came to do later projects, let's say the one about a few years later, I did one which where I'd finished a CD-ROM and I was going back to traditional media in about 2000, and I did a project about the Golem and the rabbi in Prague who created him, and I made a huge diagram connecting all those histories for that.
That was a big entry point for me in getting interested in cartography, G-Projector on the NASA website. But maybe to answer the question in a different way, since I said that one yesterday, in a very general way, like one point, as I was going down the cartography rabbit hole or whatever, like researching a little bit more, getting interested in it, just some of the very basic things that I probably should have known about previously, like north being up being just a construct. I hadn't thought about that. It hadn't been anything I'd spent a lot of time thinking about. And so something like that where you're in elementary school and the map's on the wall and it's this thing that you're never kind of taught to question. It's there as a tool, more like a ruler that you're just supposed to use and not ask questions about why that's in the middle or that's bigger than this or why north is facing up. And so that moment for me was one where I really started falling in love with ideas sort of as a metaphor for thinking about other systems. Like if we can look at other systems and question things that are both things we take as just fundamentally sound, like north being up, and if we can use that and start to question things like social media, things like networks, from that very premise that we have not ever questioned in the past, that to me seemed like an impulse I was interested in exploring.
In my case, I'm just so much interested in diagrams and charts in general. So when I develop my own project, I always make charts in whatsoever reasons, several charts actually, diagrams. So it's just a spontaneous thing to get interested in those things. But the navigation system, I never thought about it before developing the project. And I was astonished by how those riders' attachment to the app and how their bodily movement was actually synchronized to the app's orders and alarms and calls. It's highly doji actually, and it really made me to think about this multiple existences in many different realms, the reality, not only the physical realities, but also the app's reality, virtual reality, everything.
Yeah. There is one particular aspect that, for me, kind of came out when looking and reflecting upon all of your work, and either present in the project you presented today or project you've been working on in the past, which is the importance of somehow technological literacy, and somehow the idea that like all of these tools that you're dealing with or using in your work, you have the tendency to kind of like manipulate them and customize them and modify them. So dealing with softwares, dealing with the design of interfaces or websites, or more broadly also like using the internet as a platform for delivering the artwork itself. But of course, it's within this approach, there's like an embedded critique to all of these tools as well. So I wonder what's the evolution in your career regarding this idea of somehow the difficulties and the necessity as well to kind of learn complex tools and go through like complex histories and complex, like also like to understand like mapping projections is not an easy task. So what's the kind of trajectory in this? And I think, Suzanne, we talked a bit about yesterday about this as well, also your initial embracing of some coding and developing softwares in video games, and then your movement to a completely different kind of technique. So I wonder if you could talk a bit about this trajectory.
Okay, so since I'm one of the oldest person of the group, I started off quite a long time ago. So I started using computers in 1991 to make fictional video games. And at the time, it's a long story, but I was very interested at the time in imagining what those new technologies of video games, what effect they would have on society and culture and politics in the future. So that's like, I think that's over 30 years ago. No one at the time seemed to be interested in them. I made all these fictional video game works. I got an Amiga computer. And then, so that's 91. So quite quickly after that, I got into the internet. And then the internet started developing and evolving, and there was a lot of things like discussion groups, things like NetTime, for example, rhizome lists, all these discussion lists. And it appeared briefly in the mid-90s, mid to late 90s, that this new technology of the internet or the World Wide Web was going to be like another kind of counterculture, another way of decentering power and changing the world. Everyone was very excited about it. And in that flurry of excitement, I learned Director, which was a CD-ROM authoring software, and I made this huge interactive CD-ROM about my alter ego. And then I noticed in all the media festivals and everything towards the end of the 90s that everyone was getting more and more obsessed with the actual technology itself. We all knew that technology had come from the American military originally, and we all knew it could have potentially disastrous outcomes. But it seemed that the new media world itself was getting into the arms race of, every year it was like, well, now we're going to show mobile phone art because mobile phones could suddenly take videos and things like that. And so around 2000, when the internet seemed to have become really governmentized and corporatized, and people I knew who had refused to buy computers were suddenly buying them because they could buy things with them online, I decided to turn against it as much as possible. Obviously, I still use my computer and I'm dependent on it, and I'm dependent on the internet. But in terms of outputting my work, I decided to go back to more traditional media and work that I could make in transit. I was very nomadic at the time. I could do it on my lap, on an A4 piece of paper, carry my pencils in my bag. And then eventually, in order for people to see it, I could scan it and put it on my website, but I could also show it in galleries. And I returned to the idea of being happy showing in actual physical spaces. So I've had a kind of up and down thing. So sometimes I will make a video, and sometimes I'll make, I for example use Photoshop a lot, but essentially I like to contain my practice to the kind of media which I can control myself, and which, if the entire kind of data sphere exploded, I would still be able to have my work hidden in my wardrobe.
What was the question?
I can piggyback on that.
Yeah.
What you're saying rings true for me in a lot of ways too. Like, I feel in a certain way lucky to have lived through an era of a younger web. I was younger also, and so I'm happy that I was around during an era where I was very optimistic and maybe too idealistic, but I was feeling that this medium could be empowering, and it made me inspired to learn the tools, to learn how to write code. I'm happy that I was introduced to that earlier version of the web. A lot of the undercurrent of the Red Lines project I showed is me wrestling with also sort of flipping sides and having trouble sort of getting up in the morning to make net art sometimes, to seeing what it's been turned into. But in terms of like a specific relationship with code, I mean, like, that presentation was hand-coded in HTML. Like, you know that saying where, like, at some point you kind of, like, give up on fashion and you just wear what you were wearing for the rest of your life from that moment forward? I'm that way with code. Like, I kind of gave up after, like, CSS somewhere, so I love handwriting code, but in terms of sort of access to tools and coding and moving forward, I haven't been... I don't know. It seems a little bit daunting to jump into the newer systems, to be honest, so I'm still out here writing HTML code.
Yeah, the question was about like the role of technical literacy. And for example, also in your video, you use like 3D scanning to kind of incorporate your urban environment, and of course understanding how the interface works. So how much you go into that kind of...
Well, a long time ago, probably 2 decades ago, I used to be a Flash motion graphic interactive designer, the deceased media. And since then, I changed my occupation to be a visual artist, and made a lot of videos, moving images, but without any interactive elements in it. But only like 3 or 4 years ago, I started my first game engine simulation with Unity developer. Started to work with him since then. So we created one-person point of view, single-player VR narrative, strongly narrative sci-fi, cyberpunk fiction. And then I realized how powerful this game engine simulation could be, and how much it could change our kind of visual culture. So after that, I made VR chat performance. So I guided some of the audiences in the world, VR chat world, and then I guided them through this underwater environment that I built for my VR project. So it was expansion of media experience. And this is rather a conventional single-channel video. And there are a lot of technologies used, such as game engine simulation for the racing sequence and 3D scan, a LiDAR scan of the streets where I'm living actually, the small street alleyways in South Korea, very typical Seoul streets. And we used iPhone actually for this LiDAR scan function. It's embedded in LiDAR scan in iPhone, and then rearranged it in 3D software afterwards. Also, we scanned the actor to give some motion into this bone, and so on. And interfaces were made out of graphic design.
Right?
Yeah, graphic design.
Yeah.
So I think, well, apart from the project, and then I even developed a very simple game simulation, 10 minutes long game simulation out of those 3D model of this deliberate answer world. The small street alleyways in Asia, which really tickles this Asia futurism, like techno-orientalism aspect. So I converted it into one single-player game. It was shown at CO Berlin as part of their CO Digital Festival 2 months ago in December. So I think game engine and one-person point of view experience really opened this possibility of thinking about, this virtual retina, I like to call it somehow. Camera is not really a definite image generation tool anymore. And since this virtual production became really widespread, this something which attached on top of our retina, physical retina functions in VR and in one-person player game, and this point of view experiences really dominate our culture, I think. So I'm deeply thinking about this so-called virtual retina thing for as a theory or something. Yeah.
A central element to, I think, the theme of this panel, but also of all your work in very different ways, is the idea of fiction that takes, as I said, like different forms. I'm thinking, in your latest project, Suzanne, the one you presented today, is literally like a media in your case, so that it can use stories, imaginations, and future fictions and speculations to interact with a planet, with a planetary, and with a group of scientists involved in your project. But also, for example, the use of fictional characters in your work before, and also, I think very similarly between the work of you, Suzanne, with Rosalind Brodsky and Petra Genetrix in some of your long body of work. And I think in the case of Ivan is even the use of like this recursive use of the shape of the face brings in a forms of fictional, like a sort of fictional character within a very basic bare-bone form of representations of the geographic system around the planet. So completely disrupts this grid, in which we are used to represent coordinates and this understanding of space. And of course, then there is this idea of using very kind of scientific, or what we deem like objective form of representation, but instead to tell completely other stories. So I wonder, if you can reflect a bit about this, on these ideas of role of fiction. Suzanne, if you want to jump in.
We'll start again. Okay, so I think my work's quite various, so it causes kind of problems when you try and like buttonhole it into one type of model. So let's say I haven't really done anything to do with fictions until the fictional video game stills, and they were a way of making a commentary about actual video games. Quite simply. Then with Rosalind Brodsky, so the Rosalind Brodsky project was from 1995 to 2006 and involved millions of things, TV shows, psychoanalytic case histories, her band, time-traveling research projects, is working for this institute in the future, and her past, her grandparents who were murdered in the Holocaust and her attempts to rescue them through time travel, and also to go to the Russian Revolution and to go to London and Paris in the 1960s, where she sold her feature vibrators to pay for her psychoanalysis with the 5 key psychoanalysts of the 20th century. So it was quite a convoluted project, and essentially for that project I would say the fiction was more on the level of kind of parallel alter ego history, which engaged with a lot of issues which were important to me, but through an alter ego who had time-traveling powers and a different life than mine. And then probably the next time I ever invented another character was probably HFT the Gardener. So HFT the Gardener was not an alter ego. HFT the Gardener was a fictional construct. He was a high-frequency trader in the City of London who eventually became an outsider artist through the use of psychoactive drugs. And that work, in a sense, it's much easier to compare it to the idea of a novel, where a novelist will invent characters, fictional characters, but sometimes, let's say in a historical novel, there will be fictional characters with actual histories, so those characters are inserted into histories which happened. But in the case of HFT the Gardener, he was like an umbrella character who researched a whole bunch of things which were actually in the world, like the whole histories and varieties of psychoactive plants and a whole lot of stuff to do with high-frequency trading, for example, and the routes and the networks and the companies. So all the material in there was actual, but it was like a fictional character who was the kind of the web that held it together. I'm not sure, correct me if I'm wrong, I don't know if I've invented any other characters or made any other fictions necessarily apart from that. Hexen 2.0 was really a historical and potentially futuristic take on the history and future of technology in relation to society. Yeah, Survive Ref. Okay, I'm wrong. It's The Escapist and Survive Ref, the two kind of sci-fi characters who are completely kind of disembodied. They're more recent. Survivor Ref was possibly the last survivor of the human race who may be a human being or might be a machine. And the work was a transmission of a view from the future, that future, back to us. And the escapist was a kind of completely disembodied character who possibly lived inside a black hole, who had a whole nother perception of the cosmos. So I can't really analyze it in the sense that you might want, but I'm just describing the differences between the different fictions that I use and their structures. And
I think I started to make a speculative fiction from 2017, only from then. And before then, I mostly made more historically driven fictions. So for me, reading a lot of ethno-futurism fictions, for instance, Afrofuturism, Gulf futurism. There are several branches of ethno-futurism, actually, Mongol futurism, India futurism, and so on and on, Sino-futurism. So I became very interested in how those speculative fictions try to deal with these political contemporary issues in a distant point of view, distant perspective, and how successfully convey this aesthetic and playful and, political function. So I made a series of fictions called, what was it? Porosity Valley series. And yeah, there's this being protagonist called Petra Genetrix, which is not a human being. It's a part of mineral clusters. It can be seen as some divine entity, and yeah, it tries to migrate to another certain platform, new platform. So it was a depiction for the multi-layered migration of physical and cloud migration, platform migration, and everything. So yeah, I've still continue making the fictions since then.
Thank you.
I don't historically think about making fiction as from the onset of projects, but the one thing that popped into my mind when you mentioned it was in the previous work I showed, the landscape series, the Red Lines project. I got more into thinking about the history of like how landscape has been depicted historically in paintings and in other ways. And there's like a fiction reality thing in my understanding that happens with depictions of landscapes where if we're thinking about historical paintings like pastoral paintings or romance paintings, like they're presented somewhat as reality, like this beautiful picture, this beautiful scenic blue skies and green grass. But actually that's more of the fiction, and then what lays underneath is what got so interesting to me about landscape-based imagery and how it has this face that feels very comforting and like there's not much hiding beneath the surface. And then when you start kind of analyzing a lot of these images and thinking about how labor is implied and how historical power structures are sometimes implied or intentionally erased, you know, a lot of these images intentionally have no people in them. And so those images, they present reality, but they actually are somewhat fictions, and the reality probably has more, in some of those cases, lead to dangerous things like nationalism, a lot of these images. And so that was the project where I started thinking about maybe that relationship between how fictions play into these. And then the thing I got excited about maps is I feel like it's actually easier to see those things and talk about than in landscape painting, where with maps, it's pretty understood once you get fairly into shallow waters with cartography that, okay, all these are narratives, I see that now. And once you start looking at all maps as narratives, it's easier to start to ask these questions that I think are interesting questions to ask of technology in general.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think there are a lot of things coming up around this idea of like reliability of information and like how do we trust certain forms of delivering this information based on what we see. But maybe it's a good moment to open it up to the public, to the audience, if there are any questions. There are already some here. While the microphone arrived, there's one from online, which I think it connects quite nicely to the last things you were saying even. Again, there's no name from or what this. Thanks for the instructive and inspiring talks. In the context of the current geopolitical polarizations, what are the alternatives to the militarization of the technologies of navigation in terms of spatial, Cartesian, planetary projections, compared to other methods of data visualizations of non-Euclidean mappings of a time-based complexity of social and subjective relations? Quite a lot to unpack here. But maybe it's like, yeah, how do we think about alternatives to somehow technologies and form of representations that have been tightly connected to military technologies and violent tools? And
yeah, if I comment a little bit about that, well, I don't know much about military things, but I know that most of the technology, highly developed technologies, have been developed through military purposes. And the navigations, I recently heard from a drone developer who creates all types of commercial drones, including driving, delivering drone and everything. He had really amazing insight about the history of navigation and things. That's how I got to know those history of navigation here. And he recently mentioned that GPS, probably you all know that GPS, United States ownership thing, and European nations has got Galileo, is different one. It's similar to GPS, but the name is different. And China has got their own GPS system, Beidou, and a lot of countries has got their own systems due to the privacy and surveillance purposes. And you know that Tesla developed this, what do you call it, Tesla's satellite system? Yes, Starlink, yeah. Well, Tesla's strategy is to spread thousands of satellites in a really cheap price whereas GPS is functioning with 36 satellites, very minimum number of satellites, and it's highly expensive to send off one satellite. But Tesla made kind of game-changing technology. So I heard from him, well, I'm not sure if it's really true, that Starlink will really replace the GPS very soon. And even the Starlink is in charge of managing the satellite kind of data and things by US military things. They are the kind of carer of those data, everything. So soon we will see a different kind of ruling system of our navigation, I think.
Yeah, we have a question from public.
Yeah, thank you for your talk. I'm interested to try to steer this conversation into how do we hack these techno-colonialist tools that are sort of more and more forcing us to see the world through a kind of military-industrial complex lens that we all get more deeper immersed in. And I wanted to tell you all about a very interesting film that just came out from a group in Prague called Kino Lab, and they made a documentary, a short documentary called Digital Dissidents, and they're fighting maybe on a policy level, but in different ways. However, they can inspire people to think about resisting being forced to use certain tools in certain situations, to be simply a citizen of a state or a country or a land or or an anarchist, not of those parameters. So they're analyzing this in very clever ways about hey, I shouldn't have to use this mobile phone to subscribe to something or to have my food delivered, because we're going to get more and more immersed into something where even the basic necessities for life will have to come through these computer tools, which can all be monitored, surveilled, controlled, and essentially control our lives more and more. So you all are great artists to think about how to visualize this kind of struggle of how to hack this concept that we have to use certain tools in order to live our embodied physical existence on real territories.
I'm picturing you running a delivery service where you don't use GPS coordinates and you just use the stars, and it's very slow and the food's always cold,
That's amazing. Only in the night.
Yes. I don't know a better answer than that, sorry. It's a difficult but really good question, obviously.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I think yesterday I was in attending a panel in the Blue Room, and they were talking about all the type of minor technologies and also how can we descale the technology, whereas all the big techs and big data is dominating in our environment. So I think this thought experiment for the moment is really important to think about, to resist, but I really don't know much about technology itself and mechanism, so if someone know something about it, please let us know. Yeah.
Suzanne, do you have anything to... Yeah, of course, please.
Well, I mean, this has been a big nightmare of mine since this started. It's been driving me nuts, and it's one reason I made the Hexen 2.0 project, to try and allow tools for people to think their way out of it. So I just wanted to say that I'm still working on it in my abstract kind of crazy way, and I've just started making Hexen 3.6, which is the update to Hexen 2.0. And I'm hoping that somewhere in the labyrinth of information that I'm working with, there may be some clues, not from a technologist, but just from putting together information in different ways, possibly.
I believe we have another question. Yeah.
Hi, thank you so much for all the talks. It's really good collection of documentations and practices which are connected to the maps. And for me, one aspect which is very interesting is the agency of maps. And as even you were speaking about the projection, like somehow like semantically, the very word projection has the implication of a project list. So like a map has a certain project built into it. So I wonder, maybe you could speak more about the agency of maps in our everyday lives. And like, I saw that maybe this the slogan of Transmediale, we can put this in the opposite, like inverted, and instead of model map fiction, what do these fictions of our maps model in our worlds? So yeah, something about agency.
One thing that comes to mind is the artist Agnes Dene, many of you might know. I think it was in the 70s, she did an exhibition called Projections, and she made these beautiful pencil on grid paper, absurdist projections. Like she made a projection of the world that was a hot dog. And I loved that work because, and I don't know if maybe this answers the previous question too, but this impulse to jump in with a level of absurdity that says, hey, I'm here, I can make this thing too, I can be a part of this discourse with all the history and all these cartography people, and I can make my own projections. I felt like that was like a beautiful gesture that I look to a lot. The relationship with maps, one thing I was thinking watching your film just on stage for the first time, it was reminding me that I used to be a delivery person a long time ago, and I was thinking about how foreign my reality of, this will say my age now too, but delivering pizzas without a smartphone, without a map, without GPS, how different my relationship to the map in the pizza shop was, which was just stuck to the back of the oven, you know, and how different my relation of wayfinding was, which had nothing to do with the screener being locked into that system. It had to do with like unrolling the window and asking people at the traffic light, where's this street, where's that? It was very social. I don't know if that answers the question, but definitely the relationships to maps has changed so much between, I was thinking about your speculation of fiction and how that seems so much closer to me now than my own lived reality, delivering food not that long ago, right?
Now, Suzanne, if you have anything to add on the agency of maps and diagrams.
I don't think I've got anything to add.
I think we're running a bit towards the end with our time, but I wonder if there is any other question from the audience. Okay, then this was like a fantastic conversation, and I'm really thankful to all of you for joining and for presenting your work. So thank you. Suzanne.
Thanks, Suzanne.
Thank you.